Okay. Today, what we're going to be doing is, just a second, I'm going to give you a break. Then when we come back, we're going to be talking about leadership. But as we get into that, we want to try and focus on the organization qua individual. Get a better idea, get a better grounding of the way individuals behave in and influence organizations that are in turn impacted by those organizations. And then we're going to end the class tonight with an exercise that will help prepare you for your timeline exercise that's due next week. And next week we'll be focusing on planning, right? And you're going to notice that the timeline thing is, isn't it due next week? Yeah, it is, huh? That the timeline, that little reading you have and such, is just simple as can be, and the timeline is as simple as can be. But we'll have an exercise to do that. So any question about where we're going today on that? Okay. One of the handouts that I added to your D2L site, and I put it up earlier in the structure, it's in the unit on week 1, as a matter of fact, is this handout on targets for organizational change. Anybody seen that yet? I may have even sent it to you in an email as well, I'm not sure. I did? Okay. And you'll notice here that consistent with the different layers or levels of our prismatic organization model, there are implications for organizational change that are noted for each of those particular levels. The individual level, the interpersonal and group level, the organizational level, and the environmental level. So you might want to continue to bring this to class. I would suggest that you do that. Just kind of keep it out in front of you as we go through this content, because if occasionally you were to scan down at this, you might see that there would be application in terms of targets for organizational change, given what we happen to be talking about that particular moment in that particular week. My own belief is that that model, the prismatic model, does two things that I find to be, for me, very, very important. One, it gives me a schematic, a way of helping to kind of organize different theories that come from different disciplines, or even from the same discipline, but that focus on different strata or substrata, subsystems of the organization. So that if I have, for example, I'm studying about task groups, well, with that prismatic organization framework, I have a way of thinking about where I fit that particular theory about groups into an overall organizational structure. Oh, and by the way, then if I were to have managing to look down at this kind of thing, I might be thinking about leadership styles as it relates to not just individuals, but also to groups. And also the leadership styles that might be expressed within a group. One of the things a manager can do, for example, we'll talk more about this next week, is to try and help groups actually develop skills that are helpful for their members and also conducive to organizational goal achievement. Not all groups have the same ability to process experiences or to handle tasks. And so one of the tasks of a manager is to help train or staff a particular group with that kind of expertise, or to provide feedback for that. One might do that with regard to leadership styles that are being exercised within a group, particularly when you see that the leadership style, let's say, might be too laissez-faire. For example, that it's too much of a social kind of environment for group decision making, and there isn't enough focus on task at hand. So that might be just one example of that. Conflict management styles, really, really important in terms of managing the environment of the work and helping members of a work group be able to work together or work alongside one another if that's the nature of the task, and still achieve that kind of task accomplishment. So continue to bring this, if you will. But now let's start looking at the organization, particularly focusing on the individuals that are a part of it. And just by way of a kind of a preliminary for this, and it probably would help if you actually saw the PowerPoint, wouldn't it? There you go. There you go. All right. We can think of various kinds of interactions that focus on individuals, and so we can think about the interaction of individuals with other individuals. We can talk about the interaction of individuals with groups and in groups. And we can also talk about the interaction between the individual as individual and the organization of which he or she is a part. Now, again, go back to what we talked about several weeks ago with regard to boundary. I think it was just last week. Boundary seems like such an easy kind of concept when you're talking about a system or even an organization. But on the one hand, the boundary might be defined by people who have formal employment by an organization or in an organization. It might be defined more broadly as including all individuals for whom any of those individuals has an employment relationship, which gets kind of close to what we were talking about last week with regard to military bases and who's in the military, who isn't, who has the ID, for example. It could be that boundary refers and membership refers to anybody who has a performance obligation relative to an organization. And in this case, clients clearly would find themselves included within our organizational boundary in organizational membership, because human service organizations certainly claim performance expectations upon most clients. As a way of laying down some of the basic kind of concepts, I want to start by looking at a couple of sociological concepts, and that has to do with roles and statuses. And one of the reasons is that we're going to see that status is particularly important to both self and others. Status, in fact, is a variable, an important one, in a number of significant theories having to do with personality and development. From a sociological standpoint, how would you define status? What's the meaning of the word status?
It could be your, in an organization, are you talking about?
Just generally, if we were talking in a sociology class.
It could be your birth order in a family system.
Okay. Like socioeconomic status, yes, it could be that. Let's just look in the class right now. Right? Are there certain kind of major status distinctions or status assignments that we make in this class? Male, outstanding, outstanding. That really is true. That really is true. Because we tend to think of gender as simply biologically driven. And certainly biology is an important factor here. But how are we going to define the biology? Do we define it in terms of genitalia? Do we define it in terms of reproductive ability? Do we define it in terms of genetic composition? Let's just go with the latter, right? Because that's probably the most neutral for a class discussion. Or are we just defining gender in terms of XX or XY? Because if we're doing that, you realize that we're omitting certain statistically abnormal but still quite common variations, XYY or XXY. I'm not a biologist, I don't know what those things are, but I know that there's those kind of variations. Now in our culture, we tend to come down in an either-or kind of approach to gender, don't we? Male or female. But that's a status distinction. That's a status distinction. Along with the status distinction becomes certain kind of role expectations, though. Let's just stay with gender for a second. How are role expectations with regard to gender as a status expressed in our culture?
Well, at one time, the same as men worked and brought home the money and women stayed home.
That's right, and raised children, or were the homemakers. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. How about in a class right now? Are there ways in which roles are played out, statuses and associated roles, that people play out the status of male or female? There actually are. If you look around, I'll bet you every one of you is pretty confident that you can assign a gender status to everybody in this classroom right now. And you're doing it based upon visual cues for the most part, right? So what are some of those visual cues? Because that has to do with the way The role expectations are actually crafted in our culture. And we'll start off by breaking the boundary right away. Hair, all right? Typically, women are expected, females are expected to have longer hair. As I look straight in the camera, I can say that seriously, right? Males are expected to have shorter hair. Yeah. All right. Back in the 50s or in the 40s, it was much more common women to be wearing dresses and skirts, right? Things change. Things change. What are some other statuses that are being played out here in the class?
Your ethnicity, right? Your demographic area. There's all kinds of ways that you can rate.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, yeah. Full-time students, part-time students, students, professor, staff. Yeah, yeah. We've got a variety of different statuses in the room right now. And again, one of the reasons, and I almost want to apologize for this, that you're forced to listen to me is because I'm the person who's the teacher. I'm the person who's the professor here. And so there's a certain expectation that I'm going to be providing you with content and facilitating discussions and simulations and exercises and whatever else we do. Right? If I don't live up to those expectations, which are also expectations that you have, I would guess that there would be some complaints about that kind of thing. Right? If Zion came in, instead of running the camera, you know, sat down and started taking notes because she's that absorbed in this content, I want you to know that, all right? Then again, there would probably be some concern about who's running the camera and how the film is being processed and those kind of things. There are certain kind of expectations. On the same token, if any of you get up behind that camera and try and pull those headphones off of her head, right, I imagine we're in for a bit of a tussle. Because again, those aren't the expectations that are associated with your particular status in this class at this point in time. Right? And so those expectations are very much linked to particular statuses. Now think about that in just a second. Think about the fact that there are a variety of statuses, that every culture and society defines statuses somewhat creatively, somewhat slavishly as well, in terms of borrowing from their past or borrowing from other cultures or societies. Right. Think about how the expectations, the role expectations for that particular status or associated with those statuses can either be challenging to individuals, be comfortable for individuals, overwhelm individuals, be antithetical to their values or to their beliefs or to their preferences, and yet those are expectations that they have or that the culture has that are associated with those statuses. Think of the impact that that might have on self, how you interpret yourself, how you define yourself, and how others define that. I want to talk just a second about the looking glass self. Charles Horton Cooley. Has anybody heard of that concept? Comes out of social psychology. All right. You up for giving us an explanation of your understanding of the looking glass self?
What I remember of it is seeing yourself the way others see you.
Pretty close. Seeing yourself the way others see you. Okay. Is that 100% accurate in terms of the way others see you?
I guess it depends on what others are looking at me.
Okay.
And we wear masks.
We wear masks. Okay, cool. We're going to get to Johari Window in just a second, which is another way of looking at that kind of thing. Right? By the way, one of the reasons that I'm talking with you about these particular concepts right now is because for so many people, the organizations that they find themselves affiliated with and the statuses that they have within those organizations profoundly affect their social identities and then eventually affect their personal identities as well, the way they see themselves as well. The roles and the role expectations that they experience have profound implications for mental health, have profound implications for the way personality develops, for the way social skills are either challenged, rewarded, or extinguished based upon the rewards and the punishments, let's say, the implications of experiencing or behaving in certain kind of ways within those various organizations. And we might be talking about an employing organization. We might be talking about some kind of reference organization, person's church, for example. We might be talking about a recreational organization that they're a part of. So the way people behave, the way they're seen by others, particularly through prominent organizations in their lives, can have a profound effect upon their identity and their experience with life. Think of the looking glass self as a dynamic, interactive way of getting to know yourself. And Cooley, just as Anna was suggesting, was arguing that identity was largely a product of one's interaction with society, but particularly with significant others. You know, we interact with millions of people in our lives, most of whom we never even know. We walk past them, we're on a street. We just walked past 152 individuals in the last 15 minutes. We didn't recognize anybody, and none of them is significant to us. We can remember one or two faces of that, and tomorrow we won't even remember that. They're entirely interchangeable. But grandma comes along, and grandma is significant to you, and you remember that interaction. Difference between significant and insignificance in terms of the people in your environment. For Cooley, as you're relating to people who are significant to you, they're relating back to you. And you have, at some level, a continuous experience of either being surprised or not surprised with the nature of their feedback to you, the nature of the interaction back to you. You're interpreting that person's behavior simply in the context of making responses to that individual as well. Now, did you ever interact with somebody and their reaction took you by surprise? Where'd that come from? You know, that sounded like the person's angry at me. What did I do to offend this kind of person? All right. If behavior comes back to us or is expressed to us in such a way that it is a surprise or that it causes us pain or confusion, we're likely to spend some time trying to assess it, trying to figure out what's going on there. Now, ultimately what's happening, I'm going to really wrap it up real quickly here. Ultimately what happens is that we use other people and the way they react to us as a gauge for how we think they see us. We don't know how they see us. We can never know how anybody else sees us or how anybody else feels about us, but we can craft some hunches about that. And the less frequent and significant our surprises in interaction with the other, the more we have reason to believe that our hunches are fairly accurate. But before we come to that point where we've crafted the correct hunch or the accurate hunch, there's likely to be some disparity between what we think of ourselves and the image that we think others have of us. Now, if that's from an insignificant individual, it's probably not going to bother us much. But if it's somebody who's significant to us, and we believe that they have a very different impression of us than we have of ourselves, we're likely to spend some energy or some time trying to figure that out. And what Cooley argues is that over time, what happens is that the mind begins to craft some kind of synthesis generally between the image we had of ourselves and the projected image, the assumed image that others have of us, that we experience in our own mind, and we try and reduce the distance between those two images. We try to reduce the level of emotional dissonance that we're experiencing. So that ultimately, if this thing were to be played out, and the number of individuals with whom we're coming into contact, let's say, is finite, so that eventually we've experienced all of them, we might actually arrive at a notion of who we are that, at least in our own mind, is consistent with the belief we have of how others significant in our lives see us. And again, for somebody who's not significant, frankly, for the most part, they don't matter in this particular exercise. So the looking glass self is this notion that we're actually looking at others to see a reflection of ourselves in their behaviors toward us. Now let's take it back to an organization, for example. and a status, because a status can also lead to a social identity. Think of the social identity of somebody who has, in an organization, a job that's regarded as menial, as opposed to a person in the organization that has a job that it's regarded as especially important and valuable to the organization. Do you think that the behavior of other people in the organization to these two people is identical across these two individuals? It's going to be very, very different probably, right? With what kind of impact in terms of the esteem of the individuals who are experiencing this contact from others within the organization. Likely, it's the latter individual who holds the more esteemed position that's going to get a lot of positive kind of feedback from others, people treating him or her with a great deal of respect, as opposed to being treated as if one were menial, as if one was identical to one's job. You know, oh, menial job, therefore menial person kind of thing, which is a kind of a natural consequence for some of this stuff. Think what happens when organizations levy performance obligations upon clients and treat them as interchangeable, relatively unimportant members or participants within the organization. Which is to say, what happens when organizations treat clients as lower participants within those organizations? What's the tacit message that's being communicated to those individuals? What happens when professionals go to work in bureaucracies and are treated as if they're interchangeable clerks or widget manufacturers working on a widget machine? You may even be doing psychotherapy or psychosocial groups or whatever, working with very, very difficult clients, and yet here's the intervention repertoire. Here's the protocol. You will follow it this way, and this way. We don't even know who's coming in that door, but our technologies and our processes and our organizational arrangements make no provision for differences. We're going to treat everybody that comes in the door as exactly the same. We have a treatment ready for them. We don't even know what their problem is yet, but we got the treatment for them. Now that is anti-professional. And yet a number of us find ourselves in human service organizations that actually require their professional staff, at least at parts, to work with that kind of logic. Okay. So from the individual's perspective, being treated this way, what kind of status, organizational position, or social position as client do you think that they're experiencing? One that's valued, or one that's essentially devalued, easily replaceable, you know, by the organization? Go ahead.
Doesn't bureaucracy, isn't it also externally dictated? Like if you take an organization that gets funding, well, the funding is saying, we want you to do it this way. So in essence, that makes that organization more bureaucratic because they're trying to follow what the funding sources are. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and it would be definitive, a driving force in explaining these kind of things if, one, the organization had no control over what its funding source was, if, two, the funding source was solely this one kind of entity or similar kind of entities that demanded the same kind of face from the organization. Right? Let's just go with those kind of things. There are cases, there are instances when the environmental actors are the single most important actors in creating an organization. We're actually going to talk about that later on in a couple of weeks or 3 weeks. And there's even a way of looking at goals. Thompson and McEwen, for example, a number of years ago talked about goals as actually largely driven by interorganizational relationships. They define goals as the nature of the relationship an organization seeks with its environment, which is really interesting. Think about that. They define goals as the nature of a relationship with an environment, which is not, hey, I'm going to achieve this kind of particular task. It's, I'm going to have this kind of relationship with this organization and this one with this client group and this one with this funding body. And I'm going to maintain that. Because I'm going to be taking these clients in need, I'm going to be doing some people processing, people changing They're going to be getting jobs over here, and these folks are going to fund me. And if I can keep that year after year, you see, I've now kind of defined my task and my environment in a different way than a conventional goal statement usually does. So you're exactly right in the sense that environment can really drive a lot of these things. But in most organizations, they've existed for a while. They're now actors themselves. They can change their environment. They can actually act back on the environment as well. And there are people in those organizations that are exercising choice. And as we've talked about before, there are probably different groups of people within the organization competing for dominance within the organization so that they can impose their own goals onto the organization itself, so they can gain control of those kind of things. Now, when you put all that stuff together, then it also, you have to entertain the notion, I think, that there's some choice that's taking place in the part of the organization, especially if it's not simply a subsidiary public organization, as to which money it will seek, what funding sources it will seek, what kind of programs it will seek to have, what kind of clients it wants to serve, what kind of outcomes it wants to achieve. When you start doing that, then you're beginning to look at the different kind of options that are available. So it becomes not simply a deterministic from the environment down kind of thing. Does that begin to speak to the issue? I don't think I've answered your question so much as I've begun to engage in some other ways of looking at it. But is that helpful? Okay. Are you familiar with the Johari window? Have you come up with that, particularly in your HBSU 1 class?
A little bit.
A little bit.
In Dr. Dalton's group class, we had it.
Okay, cool. And it's the notion that who we are is known differently to different people. So we think about these would be the things that are known to self. Do it this way. This quadrant, for example, would refer to those things that are both known to yourself and known to others. Did I do this right? Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. No, I screwed it up. But having screwed it up, let me do it this way. Let me do it this way. Not having an eraser. There we go. Known to self, known to others. Right? Here are things known to others, but not necessarily known to yourself. We've all experienced those things. They usually happen when you're talking with an intimate friend, a lover, husband, wife, somebody like that, and you hear these words, "Don't shout at me." Right? And you hear yourself saying back loudly, "I'm not shouting." You heard that, right? Okay. That's the point at which what you didn't know yourself but was known to another becomes known to yourself after a period of time. But that's an example of that kind of thing. Many times our impact, the impact of our behavior on others is something that we poorly perceive, which is, now I'm going to use it in the context of looking at self. The way we think we're presenting to others isn't the way others are seeing us. Right? The impact we think we're making upon people isn't what is how they're actually being impacted. People know differently. They know something about us that we don't know ourselves. Let's go here, 3. This is something that's not known to self nor known to others. Many times things having to do with motivation, deep fears, subconscious stuff. By definition, we don't know that subconscious stuff. Right. And yet others can see our behavior and they don't know it. They can't make out heads or tails about the behavior either. And then things that we know about ourselves but others don't know about us. From your own life, what would be some of those examples? Marcia? No. But I don't want an answer. I don't want a disclosure here. All right, that's the point. All right.
What did you
Number 4, these are things known to us as individuals, but they're not known to others. Okay, these are the intentional secrets. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, secrets. That's right.
Oh, now I get it.
Yeah, poor Marcia was getting ready to go for it. Way to go. That's a team. Taking one for the team. Right.
I have one that I can share that's not private, though. I mean, it's not a secret.
No, that's okay. It was just an example. All right, that's just an example, right? But this is the Johari window here. Right. And again, I take it back to this notion of the looking glass self, that we have an image of ourselves, we have a belief in how others react to us. It's probably different than the way it actually is, at least in terms of nuances. And yet we use our perceptions, our best hunches, to begin to craft a more consistent identity. That identity profoundly affected by organizations in an organizationally dense culture. Let's talk about the backdrop to the organizational environment within which we live. And think about the importance of work in our culture and the number of organizations that are employing organizations. Almost all of them employ somebody. And many of the more important organizations in our lives are the organizations through which we seek employment. Freud argued that emotional health was largely a function of the ability to love and the ability to work. In our culture, we've emphasized the ability to love more than we actually have the ability to work, insofar as mental health is concerned. Helen Harris Perlman, very, very important early theorist in social work, argued that there were 3 essential rungs of adulthood. Rung, think of climbing a ladder. Or think of 3 important criteria for the acquiring the social status of an adult. And for Perlman, it was work, marriage, and parenthood. Now that's somewhat aged. Parenthood. Right. But I think there's still some merit to it, particularly with regard to work. Now, when we talked about what statuses are just a few minutes ago, and Christina was right on top of a lot of the biologically associated statuses, which frankly are the ones that people tend to miss. Are you aware that adolescence is a relatively recent social status? It's a relatively recent phenomenon in the Western world. There are cultures still on Earth where adolescence essentially is a non-existent status for individuals. You're a child, and then you become an adult. There's a transition ceremony, and now you can marry, you can have children, you can go out and make war, or you can go out and make love. In the United States, largely as a result of the expansion of our educational systems and the laws and culture around, traditions around education, adolescence has expanded. Whereas it was common for people who were 15 and 16 to be marrying 150 years ago. Oh, but it wasn't common to have a high school diploma. It wasn't common to have gone through 12 years of school. Now, even having an undergraduate degree is a fairly common occurrence within our culture. But when you stay in school, or when your status, your public identity is driven by that particular status, there's an undermining that frequently takes place in terms of your ability to hold claim to the social status of an adult. I can remember being in my doctoral program. I'd already been an Air Force officer for 4 years, gotten off active duty, went back for my doctoral degree. I'd been a psychotherapist. I was doing evaluations for people working on nuclear weapons systems. only to have at FSU one of our professors say, well, you should have been at the doctoral meeting the other day. There was a lot of stuff that was talked about that really had a lot of bearing upon your class. She was talking to 12 of us. She says, but, you know, you're students. Hold on. You know, did something just happen here? Did you just strip us of a certain level of adulthood because we happen to be back as students in college? And I think that's actually what had happened. A friend of mine went to see the dean one day, and the receptionist got on the telephone intercom combined and said, there's a boy out here to see you. He was 31 at the time and a former community mental health worker. He corrected her. But if you're a student, it strips you a bit. It undermines your adulthood. All right? How about being a client in a public service agency? Doesn't that strip you of your adulthood a lot as well? Sure. It works against that kind of thing. In the United States, we're primarily secular, materialistic. There you go. We have a very strong work ethic, which is also associated with different kinds of cultures. Some stronger, some weaker with regard to what came down through history known as the Protestant work ethic. Oh, by the way, who was responsible for framing the major conventions associated with the Protestant work ethic, that concept? You've heard of him. Max Weber. Yeah, yeah. The alternative for most people to a world of work is a work of dependence as opposed to interdependence. And for many people, it's a formal and largely residual welfare system. How does work affect the personality? How does the possibility of affiliation with an employing organization affect personality? Well, among other things, it can provide for some level of economic independence or interdependence. And with that, some level of social independence. Before you were gainfully employed, before you were employed such that you could provide for yourself, how many of you ever heard these famous words? Quote, as long as you're living under my roof, you'll do it my way. Okay. Familiar to anybody? Yeah, sure. Uh-huh. As soon as you have a paycheck where you can buy your own accommodations, you can pay your own rent, you know, you can buy your own food, you can own your own car, you can go into partnership with a bank for all of those things is really what it amounts to, all right? It changes the way people relate to you, and you permit people to relate to you for the most cases. You begin to gain social independence. Work can affect a personality by virtue of the activities that work requires of you. Back at another university, I taught a course on employee assistance programs, occupational social work, the relationship of work to human well-being. And one of the assignments that I thought was fascinating, I just loved it, and students tend to love it too, was an exercise on the meaning of work. So we would read some stuff about different people's experiences with the kind of work that they did, anything from surgeons to prostitutes in terms of the way they related to work and what it meant for them. And then the assignment for the students was go out, interview somebody that you know. You already know, you know fairly well, but interview them about their work, their experiences, the impact that work has had upon who they are from their own perspective, and write that up. And that's your assignment. And it was fascinating to read this kind of stuff. You know, can you imagine, for me, for example, the notion of, A highway patrolman who, just think of it. How rare it is for a highway patrolman ever to encounter somebody at work with a smiling face? I mean, it's as bad as a dentist when it comes to that, right? But a dentist doesn't have to clean up body parts after a terrible accident. That would keep me awake for weeks at a time. I don't know if I could do that kind of work. And yet people do it every day, 24/7, Or nurses, or the art that somebody might see in being a computer repair technician. The challenge that has for them and how that just buoys them up. Different strokes for different folks, clearly. But work affecting the personality by either providing people with challenges that they can accomplish or by overwhelming them with tasks that are far beyond their ability to master. Exposing them to threats. People who work with noxious and dangerous chemicals. I had a student once whose father was an hazmat specialist. So when there was some kind of really, really nasty chemical spill or radioactive accident or something like that, he would don his special protective suit and go off into that environment, leaving the student and her mother crying every time. And yet he was helping people in our society by containing what would have been otherwise a much more dangerous kind of event. And yet at what kind of cost to family, and then at what kind of emotional cost to him, knowing that he was putting them through this every time he went out to work. Day in, day out, 24/7. People experiencing assaults or supports to their personality. Changes in the personality depending in part upon the kind of defenses, coping mechanisms that are called for, the strength of those coping mechanisms, the duration in which they're required. But work also affects the personality in terms of social needs. Helping people to meet social needs sometimes, putting them in situations where need is required but not available in others. But among those social needs, the opportunity for recognition, for approval, for the experience of personal power and interpersonal power, even for affection and respect. And of course, anything that was framed positively could also be framed negatively. The absence of that or the counter to that, depending upon what we're talking about. Work provides for social identity. In general, the world of work calls for, and the world of formal organizations call for, higher level ego functioning. They call for self-discipline. They call for people who have a constant self-identity, a self-definition, for a certain level of interpersonal skills. And formal organizations, as opposed to informal groups or families, tend to have more specific written or formal expectations about these kind of things. We know in social work that we see lots of people whose strength of ego, if you will, around these kind of things is insufficient, at least given the pressures they're under at that point in time, to meet the demands that formal organizations place on them or require them. And that's why they come to see us. So people having problems and interpersonal problems at work frequently. People finding the stressors at work too great. People who can't even meet the needs for punctuality at work come to see us. And then self-actualization. Think how frequently, first of all, take a moment, put down your pen for a second, pens and pencils. It's just a little quick exercise, all right? I want you to think about what you want out of your life. I want you to think Of course, that's a whole lot of stuff. But I want you to start driving way up there in that Maslow hierarchy of needs, where we're talking about self-actualization. You've already thought about that. I mean, you've already made decisions in your being here that are part of that kind of thing. Right? I want you to begin to identify for you some of the major components of what for you self-actualization consists of. Then I want you to answer this question. Do organizations figure in how you achieve that or how you express that? Do organizations figure in your achievement of what you regard as your actualized self? Do you have to go through organizations to get there? Or do you have to be within an organization in order to experience that? How many of you have thought of several, one or two, well, several would be two or three, wouldn't it? Components of the actualized self that don't involve organizations as either methods or as context? Anybody? Nobody? Okay, right. I don't want you to have to describe what your actualized self is, right, as it stands now. But as you think about those things, is it necessary for you to work through organizations in order to achieve that?
Are you limiting this to organizations you work for?
No,
Okay.
I'm not. Or is it necessary for you, for example, to be in an organizational context to experience that? You know, be truthful, I'm achieving part of my actualized self by being a professor. You can't do that without being in an organizational context, and you can't do that without having come through an organizational context. Oh, and by the way, when you get there, it ain't that great, but which is part of also aging and all. But you know, that's the notion I'm getting at. So now, in that context, as you think about your actualized self, right, what you aspire to and to be, are there, when you look at the major elements of that, are those organizationally free in the sense that you don't have to get through any organization to get there? You don't have to be in any organization to experience that and do that? I mean, it's possible. It certainly is. That's what I'm saying. For most of us, some kind of participation in or through organizations is absolutely central to our ability to achieve the actualized self. That begins to speak to how important organizations are in our environment, in our framework. Let's talk a little bit about diversity in organizations, right? These are the different kind of variables that the individual brings to the organization. And it can be an employee, it can be a client, it can be somebody at the lowest levels of the organization or at the highest. But among them, we've got different kind of biological characteristics. We can be talking about gender here, we can be talking about age, we can be talking about the term race as it is popularly used in our culture. I will step outside for a second and say that concept has no scientific basis the way it's used. Having said that, if you say that all the time, people don't know what you're talking about. Okay? There are social characteristics that people bring. And here when we're talking about characteristics, we're talking about relatively enduring kind of things. Somebody talked about socioeconomic status or ethnicity, which is largely a cultural variable. There are ways of behaving, habits of behavior. And then we're starting to blend into personality. People bring a tremendous variety of personality traits and configurations into an organization. Their beliefs, values, attitudes, their perceptions. Among those personality characteristics, there are a number that can have real significance for the organization. And we can relate this to a fellow by the name of Holland and his thinking about the personality job fit. Now, here we're talking about employment in an organization. For example, there's the concept of locus of control. You're familiar with the concept of locus of control? All right. The extent to which you feel that your life is determined by outside forces as opposed to being self-determined yourself. Okay. People vary upon that. And so they come into an organization, some of them feeling a great deal of personal efficacy, high internal locus of control, others feeling largely as pawns to a greater set of environmental variables. There's a level of achievement that's required, or achievement orientation that people bring in an organization, very significantly. There's a power need that people have that varies across individuals. Just as there's different levels of risk-taking comfort that people will have. Some people are much more comfortable with as a risk taker. They're more comfortable gambling, in a sense, with various kinds of outcomes. And then you have these different kind of personality types depending upon which theorist you're talking about. You've heard of some of these, the theory A personality, pretty tightly drawn. We might think of them as the obsessive compulsive kind of individual, high anxiety levels, tremendous needs for control, for power. There's the conflict avoidant individual. Heaven help you if you're in a group and your supervisor is conflict avoidant and one of your aggressive coworkers quickly figures that out. Right? You'll frequently find the power in that department or division to be terribly askew in a very short period of time. So you begin to see this tremendous variety of variables that gets plugged into an organization. Now, the developmental cycles that I have here, I want to, for just a second, end this and go to something else. And let's hope I can get there. Here we go. I just put this up today, developing a lot of these things as we're going along. And you'll find this on your D2L site. I don't believe you have the handout, or at least most of you probably don't. And this is Shine's stages of a career cycle. Now, we're not going to go over Erickson's psychosocial stages here in class. You've already done that in your HBSE classes at the very, very least. But you know that that's also a stage cycle with clear developmental issues that are defined by each of one of those levels in Erickson. Here what Shine is doing is looking at the different stages of an individual's career. Because just as people come to an organization with different gender, age, ethnicity, religions, levels of education, etc., they also come at different points in their career. So the experience of the same organization, maybe even potentially the same job, might be for some people highly challenging, for others extremely rewarding, and for others a terrible insult to the self, based upon where they are in their career, what other experiences they've had. As I say this, I want you to be aware of how cookie-cutter, formulaic approaches to management are likely to be insufficient for managers, for leaders, right? Because if you're thinking that, oh, here I have a bureaucracy, here I have a set of rules and a set of expectations for employees. I have the same job. I have 3 instances of the same job, 3 vacancies to do the same kind of thing I need to fill. And I fill one with a novice, I fill one with a mid-career individual, and I fill one with somebody who's been far more advanced in terms of skills required for a job, task accomplishment, esteem, etc. But now they need this particular job. I've got these 3 positions to do the same 3 jobs filled by 3 different people in 3 different career paths at this point in time, right? Or at least stages in their career. I'm likely to experience 3 very, very different sets of experiences from these people. What formula is there out there to tell me how to deal with this situation, right? And even to say, well, contingency, which is the one I fall back on all the time, that doesn't help you. That basically says, yeah, that's right. You're not going to be able to settle in on one and only one kind of thing. Let's go back to just a second now to Portnoy. The importance of leadership according to Portnoy. What were they? What were the 3 competencies? Technical competence, okay. Interpersonal competence, that's right. And ethical competence, that's right. So I'm going to say right offhand, as a beginning point, go back to Portnoy. If you're working with these 3 individuals that are presenting in very different ways in terms of what are supposed to be identical kind of positions or roles, right? It's going to be important for you to remember what Portnoy's arguments are for effective leadership. And I would argue as well, go back to Rogers in terms of the importance of non-judgmentalism, genuineness, and basically coming down to meeting people where they actually are. Okay. But now, what are these stages of the career cycle? Okay. Let's talk about the first one. And this is before people enter into the world of work, before they enter as employees. It's that period of growth and fantasy and exploration. It's the period of time when people are exploring in a fantasy way, in a hypothetical way, the various options that are available to them, what they think would be exciting, what they think would be rewarding, what they think would be boring, etc. People enter into the world of work in the second stage. They're involved in becoming a member of an occupation or a profession. Right. Notice the major tasks: learning how to look for and secure the job, basic training, basic issue, becoming an effective member. Look at this: overcoming the insecurity of inexperience from a psychological perspective, but learning to get along with boss and co-workers from an interpersonal perspective. Moving on, full membership in the early career, accepting responsibilities, discharging your duties, performing effectively, accepting a subordinate status, but still developing initiative and expectations that are realistic to person, place, and status. Moving on to your mid-career. For many people, it's becoming more specialized. Even as you're trying to remain technically competent. And oh yeah, by the way, also now beginning to look over your shoulder at a lot of these people who are the newbies, but coming in fresh from brand new training experiences, maybe from cutting edge technologies. Okay. Performing effectively. Let's say, here we go. Gaining membership, gaining a measure of independence, or excuse me, right? Becoming more self-directed in terms of what you are, what you want to be, how you want to do things, what options are available to you. Related to this many times is the issue of whether to stay with the organization or to move to some other organization. And in our culture, and it's been true for years and years and years, if you're chasing the bucks, in most cases, you have to move from organization to organization to maximize that. Which is to say, in a different way, you typically have more leverage to negotiate increases in salaries and benefits by moving to a different organization than trying to move up within your organization, or heaven help you if you try to stay, or you're staying at the same place, you're simply trying to negotiate a better package for yourself. You have so little to offer by way of negotiating power typically, as opposed to seeking employment elsewhere. Maybe even coming back to the first organization much later on. Oh, if you do that, you're also moving back up generally when you do that. There was one study done many, many years ago that suggested that people who bounce systematically, intentionally, from organization to organization will earn anywhere from 30 to 50% more over their earned income lifetime than will people who stay loyal to and are promoted upward within a single organization. That gets to be pretty big bucks when you're talking about 30 or 40 years of employment. Okay. Notice this stage here, the mid-career crisis. This doesn't just move nicely on, if you will. This is the period of time when people have to reassess where they are in their lives relative to where they had hoped to be at some point in time. Deciding on the relative importance of work and family, which is also deciding on the relative importance of one's hopes that one had for oneself versus one's love and concern for others who are dear to you. Becoming aware of a career anchor. That is to say, becoming aware of the loss of flexibility and the other kind of losses that would be involved were you to switch careers or switch employment, switch roles. It's kind of unsettling, isn't it? To think that at some point in time your options begin to shrink when one would think that it would just be a broader and broader array of opportunities because you're much more competent, you're much more assured than one might have been years before. Late career. Now, in a non-leadership role, right, issues having to do with mentoring, broadening interests, and deepening skills, again, remaining competent, look at that, dealing with younger persons. And that might not simply be in competition. That might be people who are younger than you and even less skilled or experienced than you, but now in supervisory positions over you or as peers to you. In a leadership role, what might a late career look like? Well, using your skills and talents to promote the organization's welfare, selecting and developing subordinates. You know, you're providing for the welfare of the organization even after you leave it. Handling power, again, balancing career and family. But then there becomes the period of time when you begin to anticipate retirement or at least termination of the affiliation one way or the other. This is referred to as the decline and disengagement stage, one where you're beginning to learn how to or faced with the challenge of reduced power and responsibility, and related to that, having to find new sources of satisfaction. Many times that's new sources of challenge, followed by the stage of retirement. For some people, a very drastic change in their lifestyle. And for many, many people, the challenge that comes with that is defining yourself now without that job. Defining your self-worth without that job. Defining yourself and your self-worth without that social identity and without that almost daily affirmation from others that's been so much a part of your socially constructed self. And again, this is taken from Shine's book on career dynamics. Now let's see if I can get back to the PowerPoint.